What if evil didn't scream, but nodded politely? What if it didn't come in chaos, but in calm, rational decisions? And what if you encountered it every day, without even realizing? The most dangerous thing about evil isn't its violence, it's its normality, its silence, its ability to wear a smile and blend in. We imagine evil as loud, monstrous, and unmistakable. But most of the time, evil doesn't announce itself. It comes in the form of obedience, convenience, and routine. This is what philosopher Hannah Arendt observed when she attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi official responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she found a mild-mannered bureaucrat, a man who said, "I was just following orders." He didn't shout, he didn't hate, he just signed papers, filled out forms, and participated in the machinery of mass death, without question. This wasn't a fanatic, it was a man who had stopped thinking. Arendt called this the banality of evil. Evil doesn't always come with fire and blood. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit, speaking softly, doing what's expected, nothing more, nothing less. The true danger isn't always malevolence. It's the absence of thought, the quiet compliance with systems that destroy, simply because that's how things are. So why do ordinary people go along with evil? Why do they become complicit? Not through cruelty, but through silence? To answer this, we have to look inward. We have to explore the psychology of human behavior and the hidden forces that shape our moral decisions. And for that, we turn to minds like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and others who dared to ask, what drives us, truly? Freud and the unconscious. Freud believed that human beings are not governed by reason. We are driven by unconscious forces, desires, fears, repressed emotions. We like to think we're in control, but beneath the surface lies a complex system of urges and instincts. We repress what we don't want to see, our anger, our envy, our shame. But what is repressed doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes resentment. It becomes projection. It becomes destruction, sometimes turned outward, sometimes inward. Jung and the shadow. Carl. Jung took this even further with his concept of the shadow. The shadow is the part of ourselves we deny, reject, or refuse to acknowledge. Everything we say, "That's not me," that's the shadow. Our darker thoughts, our impulses, our vulnerabilities. But here's the problem. The shadow doesn't vanish when ignored. It waits. It acts out, subtly, unconsciously, in the ways we hurt others and betray ourselves. The more we deny it, the stronger it grows, until it leaks out in ways we can't control. We project it onto others. They're the problem. They're evil. They must be stopped. And in doing so, we protect the illusion that we are pure, good, and innocent, even as we participate in harm. Moral identity and self-deception. We all want to believe we are good people. This belief is deeply tied to our identity. But that identity can become a trap, because if I believe I'm good, then everything I do must also be good, or at least justifiable. This is how people come to support unjust systems, condemn others, or look away, without ever questioning themselves. We don't see ourselves as villains. We see ourselves as reasonable, as responsible, as doing what has to be done. And that's how evil hides, in the gap between intention and consequence, in the stories we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. The comfort of conformity. Psychology shows us that people are far more influenced by group pressure than they realize. We adapt to the norms around us. We align with what seems acceptable. We do what others are doing, even when it goes against our values. Why? Because standing alone is terrifying. Because being different is risky. Because it's easier to go along than to speak up. And so, evil doesn't need hatred. It just needs people who look away. Evil grows in silence. It thrives in indifference. It survives through bureaucracy, politeness, and the fear of rocking the boat. And it is in those moments, when we feel the urge to stay quiet, to not question, to not feel, that evil finds its easiest path. The beginning of awareness. This video is not about blame, it's about awareness. Because if evil can look like normality, then we need to look deeper. Into ourselves, into our systems, into the everyday choices we make without thinking. In the next part, we'll explore why people obey authority even when it feels wrong, how social pressure shapes moral decisions, and how ordinary people in certain situations become part of extraordinary harm without ever seeing themselves as bad. If the people who carried out atrocities were monsters, we could sleep at night. But what if they weren't? What if they were people like us, with families, with jobs, with dreams? The disturbing truth is, most evil is committed by ordinary people, not because they are evil in their hearts, but because they're human and influenced by powerful psychological forces, the Milgram experiment. One of the most famous studies in psychology is the Milgram experiment. In the 1960s, participants were told by a scientist to administer electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered questions incorrectly. The person being shocked was actually an actor and no real pain was inflicted, but the participants didn't know that. As the shocks increased in intensity, the actor began to scream, beg, and eventually fall silent. Many participants showed discomfort. They hesitated, but the scientist in the lab coat insisted, "Please continue." The experiment requires that you go on. And they did. 65% of people went all the way to the highest voltage. They believed they were harming someone and still obeyed. These weren't sadists. They were everyday people, and they just followed orders. What Milgram proved. Milgram revealed something uncomfortable, that the desire to obey authority is stronger than we like to believe, and that people will often do terrible things, not out of hatred, but because someone told them it was necessary. This is called agentic state theory, the psychological state where a person stops feeling personally responsible and acts as an agent for someone else's wishes. I was just doing my job. I didn't have a choice. These are not excuses. They are psychological realities. The slippery slope evil rarely starts with massive acts of cruelty. It begins with small compromises, with little justifications, with choosing silence just once. And the more we accept, the more our moral boundaries shift. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, when we begin to separate our behavior from our self-image. I'm still a good person, even if I did that. I had to do it. Everyone else would have done the same. These thoughts allow people to participate in systems of harm, while still believing they are moral. The role of social identity. We don't just act as individuals, we act as members of groups. Our social identities, nationality, religion, race, ideology, influence our moral decisions more than we realize. We protect the group, we adopt its beliefs, we defend its leaders, we rationalize its actions. This is why propaganda works. It doesn't just change your opinion, it tells you who you are and who your enemies are. When conformity feels like morality. In dangerous systems, morality becomes inverted. Conformity becomes a virtue. Obedience becomes a duty. Questioning becomes a threat. In these environments, doing the right thing feels like betrayal, and doing the wrong thing feels like loyalty. This is how regimes thrive. This is how atrocities become routine. I was just fitting in. I didn't want to make trouble. That's just how things work. These are the words of countless people throughout history, people who watched evil unfold and did nothing. The comfort of not knowing. Most people don't want to be cruel, but they also don't want to feel discomfort. So instead of confronting evil, they look away. They avoid the news. They silence dissent. They distract themselves with comfort and routine. This is the psychology of avoidance, and evil loves it, because evil doesn't need your support, just your silence. The crowd is not always right. The social psychologist Solomon Asch showed how easily people conform. In his famous experiment, participants were asked to compare line lengths. The answer was obvious. Yet when others gave the wrong answer, most people followed the group, even knowing it was wrong. This wasn't about intelligence. It was about pressure. The fear of standing out is stronger than logic. Now imagine that same pressure applied to political ideologies, to institutional power, to cultural silence. We like to think we're brave, but courage is rare, and evil knows that. Responsibility in tiny moments. We tend to think moral decisions are big and dramatic, but most of them aren't. They happen in quiet moments. Whether we speak up when someone's mistreated, whether we question what we're told, whether we notice a system causing harm and stay silent. These choices don't make headlines, but they shape history, because systems of evil are built on tiny moments of permission, moments where people decide not to act. What happens when no one says no? History shows us what happens. Genocides, slavery, mass surveillance, systemic injustice, and every time the people involved insist afterward, "I didn't know. It wasn't my responsibility. I was afraid." These are not justifications, they're warnings. Warnings of what happens when we stop thinking, when we let fear, obedience, and group identity replace our conscience. We've seen how people justify obedience, conform out of fear, and disengage morally. But there's something even deeper, the inner stories we tell ourselves. Because often evil doesn't begin with hatred, it begins with self-protection, the human need for psychological safety. Our brains are wired for survival, not for truth. And so when something threatens our self-image, our comfort, or our worldview, we instinctively resist it. That resistance doesn't feel like fear, it feels like certainty, it feels like righteousness, it feels like I'm right and they're dangerous. This is how cognitive dissonance works. When our actions don't match our values, we don't always change our behavior. We change the story. They deserved it. It wasn't that bad. I'm still a good person. And so people can commit acts of cruelty and feel morally clean. The illusion of moral superiority. Studies show that most people believe they are more moral than average. We rarely see ourselves as part of the problem. It's always them. But this illusion is dangerous. Because once we believe we're morally superior, we stop examining our behavior. We stop listening. We become defensive and even aggressive when confronted. This is how well-meaning people become part of harmful systems, not because they lack empathy, but because they protect their identity at all costs. The mirror of the shadow. Carl Jung wrote that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. This is true on an individual level and on a societal level. The parts of ourselves we deny, our aggression, our prejudice, our hunger for power, don't disappear. They get projected onto the enemy, onto the outsider, onto anyone who threatens our illusion of control. And in that projection, we justify hate, we justify violence, we justify silence. The performance of goodness. Many people perform goodness. They say the right things, they show the right opinions, they appear compassionate. But when real discomfort arises, when doing the right thing would cost them something, they vanish. This isn't evil in the traditional sense, it's emotional avoidance. We want to feel good, not to do what's good. And that's how injustice continues, not because everyone agrees with it, but because most people are afraid to feel discomfort, repetition, and normalization. When an unjust system persists long enough, people stop noticing it. They adapt, they adjust, they build lives around it, and eventually they defend it. That's just how things are. It's not perfect, but it works. It's always been this way. This is normalization, and it's one of evil's most effective tools, because once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Collective forgetting. Societies don't just forget history, they choose to, through distraction, through denial, through the rewriting of narratives. We erase the past, not because we're evil, but because remembering is painful, and without memory, there is no learning. And without learning, the cycle repeats, again and again. The psychology of silence. Silence is easy, it's comfortable, it makes us feel safe. But silence also communicates something. To victims, it says, "You're alone." To perpetrators, it says, "No one will stop you." And to ourselves, it says, "I'm not responsible." But we are. In every silence, there is a choice. And in that choice, we reveal who we really are. Resisting evil begins. Within fighting injustice doesn't begin on battlefields. It begins in our internal world. It begins when we question our biases, when we sit with discomfort, when we stop blaming others and start looking inward. It's not easy, but it's the only path to real moral clarity. Because if we can't face our own capacity for harm, we will never recognize it when it happens around us. The power of self-honesty. Freud believed that the human mind is layered, and that most of our impulses are hidden. But that doesn't mean we're doomed. It means we must learn to explore our own psyche, to name what we hide, to feel what we suppress, to acknowledge what we'd rather deny. That process isn't weakness, it's moral strength. The more honest we are with ourselves, the harder it becomes to participate in cruelty, even passively. True resistance is quiet, consistent, and often lonely. The people who resist injustice are not always loud. They are not always celebrated. They are the ones who ask questions when everyone else is silent, who step back when the crowd moves forward, who say no, even when it costs them. This kind of resistance doesn't always make headlines, but it changes history, because the worst atrocities were not carried out by evil men alone. They were enabled by the silence of millions. To understand evil is not to justify it, it's to prevent it. And prevention doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins inside us. Because the line between good and evil doesn't run between nations or beliefs. It runs through the heart of every human being. The shadow must be seen. Carl Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from integration. The shadow, that part of ourselves we'd rather ignore, must be acknowledged. It holds our fears, our anger, our hunger for control. But it also holds our authenticity, our depth, our potential for truth. When we deny the shadow, it controls us. When we face it, we transform. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. The courage to look within. It's easy to criticize others. It's harder to look inward and ask, where am I avoiding truth? When do I stay silent for comfort? How have I participated in harm, even unintentionally? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are the beginning of moral clarity, and without them, we remain stuck in illusion. Why systems of evil persist. Evil systems aren't upheld by villains, they're upheld by routines, by people doing their jobs, by those who say, it's not my responsibility. They persist because looking directly at injustice is painful. It demands change, it demands loss of certainty. So we turn away, we blame someone else, we wait. But waiting is not neutral. It is a choice. Responsibility in the age of distraction. Today, we are flooded with information, yet we are more distracted than ever. The problem is not lack of access to truth. It's our willingness to face it. Scrolling past suffering, ignoring structural injustice, turning activism into performance. These are the new faces of silence, and they are no less dangerous. Who would you be? We all like to believe we'd be on the right side of history, that we'd speak out, that we'd resist. But would we? When it costs your job? When your friends disagree? When your comfort is on the line? The test of conscience is not what we believe, it's what we do when it matters. The liberating power of self-responsibility. There's a paradox. Accepting your own darkness doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger. Because now, you're not acting out of ego, not out of denial, but out of choice. The more you know yourself, the harder it is to be manipulated, the harder it is to blindly obey, the easier it becomes to say, this is wrong, and I won't be part of it. Moral clarity in an unclear world. We can't control the world, but we can become people who are hard to deceive, hard to pressure, and impossible to silence. That doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. It requires reflection. It requires the willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of truth. You have more power than you think. History is not shaped by mass movements alone. It's shaped by individuals who made conscious choices to speak instead of stay silent, to think instead of follow, to take responsibility when no one else would. You don't need to be a hero. You just need to be awake. A different kind of strength. The world doesn't need more opinion. It needs more awareness. more self-honesty, more people who dare to look inward before pointing outward. This kind of strength won't make you famous, but it might make you free. In summary, evil often hides behind politeness, structure, and silence. Most people participate in harm not through hatred, but avoidance. The first step toward change is personal responsibility. Integrating your shadow is not dangerous. Denying it is. True courage is seeing clearly, acting consciously, and staying human in a world that rewards numbness. So ask yourself, honestly, would I recognize evil if it looked friendly? Would I see it in others or in myself? The choice is always there, not once, but every day. What you see depends on whether you are willing to look.